The night he found it, the temperature had already dropped to 11 degrees, and whatever was lying beneath that street lamp wasn't moving. He almost kept walking. He almost told himself it was a clump of frozen leaves, a discarded glove, something the wind had pushed against the base of the pole. But something made him stop, something quiet and instinctual, the way certain moments arrive without announcing themselves. He stood there in the dark, breath rising in clouds, and looked again. And this time what looked back at him, barely, faintly, was alive. His name was Daniel, and he was the kind of man who didn't talk much about himself. 53 years old, working a maintenance route that had him out before dawn and home after dark most of the year. He lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, the kind of house that had a porch light always on and a cat named Milo who met him at the door every evening without fail. He wasn't a man given to dramatic gestures, but when he crouched down on that frozen sidewalk and saw the small, spotted body half buried in a crust of wind-driven snow, he didn't hesitate. He thought it was a kitten. The size suggested it. The stillness suggested it. But as he carefully lifted the animal in his gloved hands, brushing away the ice that had settled into its fur, the details began to register one by one. The ear tufts, delicate as brushstrokes, rising to soft points. The paws, disproportionately large, already hinting at what this animal was meant to become. The faint rosette markings across its sides, muted beneath the cold but unmistakable once you knew what you were seeing. This wasn't someone's lost kitten. This was a bobcat, a juvenile, barely weeks old, and by the stillness of its body and the shallow labor of its breath, not far from the end. Daniel pulled it against his chest, tucked inside his coat, and walked faster than he had walked in years. He didn't sleep that night. He set up the old heating pad from the closet, layered it with a towel, then a softer cloth on top of that, and laid the animal down as gently as he could manage with hands that had started to shake, not from cold, but from something else. He filled a bowl with warm water. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you understand that sudden movements cost something. The bobcat didn't respond much at first. Its eyes stayed closed. Its breathing came in irregular pulls, the kind that makes you count between them without meaning to. He told himself this was temporary. One night, he would stabilize it through the night, make some calls in the morning, and by afternoon it would be in the hands of people who knew exactly what to do with a wild animal in distress. That was the responsible thing. That was the only thing that made sense. He said it out loud, quietly, to no one in particular, just one night, that's all. He said it the way people say things they're not entirely sure they believe. Milo appeared around 2 in the morning. He was a gray tabby, 9 years old, unhurried in the way that older cats become when they've learned the house belongs to them. He came down the hallway without a sound, and stopped at the doorway of the spare room where Daniel was sitting on the floor beside the makeshift bed, watching the bobcat breathe. Milo's eyes adjusted. His nose worked the air slowly, taking in something entirely outside the vocabulary of his ordinary life. Wild musk, forest cold, the scent of an animal that under any other circumstances would have represented danger. Every instinct he'd inherited should have told him to retreat. He didn't retreat. He walked forward. Daniel watched, not breathing, as Milo crossed the room with the careful, deliberate steps of an animal making a decision. He lowered his head. He sniffed along the length of the bobcat's body, reading its stillness, reading its temperature, reading something that Daniel couldn't translate, but could only witness, and then so quietly that Daniel almost doubted what he was seeing. Milo began to groom the bobcat's frozen ears, long, slow strokes of his tongue, methodical and unhurried, as if this were the most natural thing in the world, as if he had done it 1,000 times before. Daniel sat on the floor of that small room and didn't move for a long time. By 4 in the morning, the bobcat's breathing had steadied. Its paws, those enormous, impossible paws, had begun to twitch faintly in its sleep, the kind of movement that means a body is returning to itself, reclaiming warmth, reclaiming function. Milo had settled fully beside it now, his body curved around the smaller animal like a parenthesis, radiating heat without fanfare or drama. Daniel sat back against the wall and watched them both. Outside, the wind was still running hard across the open fields, driving the snow sideways beneath the street lamps. Inside, in this small room with its single lamp and its heating pad, and its two animals sleeping side by side, everything was still. He thought about the calls he would make in the morning. He thought about wildlife centers, about intake procedures, about doing the right thing. He thought about all of it in the abstract, logical, responsible way. But he also kept looking at Milo, at the steady, protective curl of his body, at the complete absence of fear. And somewhere beneath the logic and the practicality, something in Daniel went very quiet. The way things go quiet just before you understand that the situation you thought you were managing has already begun to manage you. He told himself just one night. The house didn't answer. He made the calls the next morning. 3 wildlife rehabilitation centers in the region. He'd looked them up before dawn, before the coffee was finished, before he'd let himself get any further attached than he already had. 2 didn't answer. The 3rd told him their intake was full through the end of the week, but to keep the animal warm, keep it calm, and call back in a few days. A few days. Daniel looked across the kitchen at the spare room doorway. Milo was already back in there. He hadn't left since 2 in the morning. He told himself a few days was manageable, practical even. He'd done the hard part already. By the 2nd morning, the bobcat was trying to stand. Daniel found them at first light. Milo curled firmly around the smaller animal, and Scout, as Daniel had quietly begun calling him without fully admitting it, pressing his oversized paws flat against the towel and pushing, wobbling, pushing again. Milo watched each attempt with an attention that looked improbably like encouragement. By afternoon, Scout was walking, unsteady and wide-legged but walking, navigating the length of the spare room with the focused determination of someone who has decided that falling is only temporary. Milo walked beside him, not close enough to crowd, but close enough to matter. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched and did not call the rehabilitation center back that day. The days that followed had a rhythm he hadn't planned for. Scout began eating solid food, small pieces, carefully prepared, and met each meal with an intensity that made Daniel laugh for the first time in longer than he could remember. Milo brought toys with quiet ceremony, dropping them near Scout's bed and waiting to see what would happen. Scout began to teethe on the leg of the spare room chair. He learned by watching Milo, the slow blink, that small deliberate gesture that cats use to say "I trust you," and began offering it back unprompted. But there were other things too. A pounce one afternoon that crossed the room in a single movement, landing with a precision that had nothing domestic about it. A stillness Scout would fall into near the window, watching the yard, reading something in the wind that Daniel couldn't access. Reminders, quiet but clear, of what Scout actually was and where he actually came from. Daniel tried twice to keep them separated at night, for safety, for the logic of it. Both times Milo found a way back. By the end of the 2nd week, Daniel stopped trying. Some things he was learning have their own understanding of what's necessary. He grew fast. That was the thing nobody quite prepares you for, how quickly wild things reclaim themselves once the crisis has passed. Within weeks the bobcat's legs had lengthened noticeably, his paws spreading wider with each passing day, his movements sharpening from the clumsy stumble of infancy into something precise and intentional. Daniel had named him Scout, though he'd resisted the impulse for as long as he could, understanding, somewhere in the back of his mind, that naming something changes your relationship to losing it. Scout and Milo still slept together, still greeted each morning with the slow, mutual ritual of head bumps and shared warmth. But their play had changed. What once looked like 2 kittens batting gently at each other now carried real weight behind it. Scout's pounces landing with a force that sent Milo sliding across the hardwood, both of them undeterred. Milo returning every time with the unshakable confidence of an animal who had decided, long ago, that this was his, that Scout was his. Daniel watched and felt the pull of 2 opposing truths. The first, this bond was real, as genuine as any he had witnessed between living creatures. The second, Scout was no longer a fragile thing in need of saving. He was becoming exactly what he was supposed to be. And the world that had made him, the open forest, the cold air, the wide silence beyond the yard, was still out there, waiting with patience that humans rarely manage. He built the outdoor enclosure on a Saturday in early March, large enough for Scout to move, to climb, to practice the stalk he'd begun rehearsing against every shadow that crossed the floor. Scout took to it immediately, nose lifted, cataloging the wind with the seriousness of someone reading an important document. He scaled the platforms in long, unhurried movements. He tracked insects through the grass with eyes that had learned, without being taught, exactly how predators see the world. But each evening, without fail, Scout would return to the glass door, and press his forehead against it, and look inside for Milo. Daniel stood on the other side of that glass, more than once watching him, this animal who was wild and domestic all at once, who carried the forest in his instincts and something quieter in his chest. The Wildlife Center had called twice. Their assessment was clear. Scout was healthy, strong, and ready for transitioning back to open habitat. Daniel knew they were right. He just hadn't figured out how to explain that to Milo, or to himself. Spring arrived the way it always does in that part of the country, not all at once but in quiet increments. A warmer afternoon here, a different quality to the morning light there, the kind of change you feel before you can fully see it. Scout felt it first. Daniel watched it happen over the course of a week, a new restlessness, a pulling toward the tree line at the far edge of the enclosure, a stillness in Scout's gaze that had less to do with the yard, and more to do with whatever lay beyond it. The wildlife staff came on a Tuesday. They were kind, professional, unhurried. They said Scout was one of the healthiest juveniles they'd seen come through a situation like this. They said Daniel had done something genuinely rare. He didn't feel rare. He felt the way you feel when you know the right thing, and the hard thing are the same thing. He and Milo walked the enclosure together that last morning. Scout moved between them, rubbing once against Daniel's leg, then pressing his broad forehead into Milo's side with a slowness that didn't belong to a wild animal in a hurry. Milo held perfectly still, eyes closed, absorbing it. Then Scout walked to the open gate, paused with one paw raised and looked back, just once, before disappearing into the trees. The house was too quiet for days. Milo moved through it like a question without an answer, checking the enclosure door, circling the rooms, crying softly in the evenings in a register that Daniel had never heard from him before. Daniel second-guessed himself in the specific, exhausting way that only comes when you've done something you believe was right, but cannot yet feel was right. He checked the trail camera on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks later, expecting nothing. Scout stood at the wood's edge, 40 yards out, larger than Daniel had quite registered during the release. Behind him, the forest was dark and deep and entirely his now. He was still for a long moment, facing the house, reading the air. And on the audio track, faint but unmistakable, 2 soft sounds rose from the porch. Milo crying into the morning, and something from the tree line, low and brief, answering back. Daniel opened the back door without thinking. Scout didn't come fully forward, but he came close enough, stepping into the yard's edge, ears forward, for Milo to cross the grass and touch his nose to Scout's in the early light. Then Scout turned, unhurried, and walked back into the trees. He had stayed only one night, but what he left behind had no expiration date. Some bonds don't need permanence to be real. They just need to be true.